The neighborhood had always been quiet in a way that looked peaceful on the surface but felt tense underneath. The lawns were trimmed to identical lengths, the houses painted within a narrow range of approved colors, and every driveway told the same story of compliance. It was the kind of place where rules mattered more than people, and where the homeowners association didn't just exist, it ruled. We had moved in believing the rules would be simple. Keep the place clean, pay the fees on time, don't cause trouble. At first, that seemed true. But slowly, almost invisibly, the HOA began tightening its grip. Notices appeared in our mailbox for things that didn't make sense. The wrong shade of mulch. A trash bin left out 10 minutes too long. Curtains that were apparently not neighborhood appropriate. Each letter carried the same tone, polite on the surface, threatening underneath. At the center of it all was the HOA president. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her reputation. She wasn't loud all the time, but she was relentless. She walked the streets like she owned them, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for violations. She spoke about community standards, the way other people talked about law and order. To her, the HOA wasn't a volunteer position. It was authority. Most neighbors avoided her. Some tried to stay on her good side. A few had already learned what happened when you didn't. My wife noticed it before I did. She saw patterns where I saw coincidences. She noticed how certain houses were targeted repeatedly while others were ignored. She noticed how complaints always seemed to land on the same families. And she noticed how quickly fear spread whenever the HOA president's name came up. Still, we kept our heads down. We followed the rules. Or at least, we thought we did. Not permitted under HOA bylaws. No details. No evidence. Just a demand for immediate compliance and a threat of escalation. We asked questions. We requested clarification. The responses were vague and delayed, written in stiff language that avoided specifics. It was clear the goal wasn't to resolve anything. It was to intimidate. That was when the pressure started to build. Over the next few weeks, the notices increased. Fines were mentioned. Legal action was hinted at. Words like eviction appeared for the first time, casually inserted as if they were normal consequences for minor disagreements. Neighbors stopped making eye contact. Conversations ended abruptly when we walked by. The HOA president's presence around our house became more frequent, more deliberate. It felt personal. Then came the morning everything crossed the line. It was quiet, early, the kind of morning where the world feels paused. My wife was home, going about her routine, completely unaware that the HOA president had decided to escalate the situation in the most extreme way possible. Instead of sending another letter or filing another complaint, she made a call. She dialed 911. Not to report a crime. Not because there was danger. But because she believed, or claimed to believe, that my wife was unlawfully occupying our own home. She told dispatch that an eviction was being ignored. That there was a situation that required immediate police intervention. It was a calculated move. The HOA president had always acted as if the rules she enforced were equal to the law. In her mind, the police were just another tool. Another extension of her authority. She expected uniforms, compliance, and a public display of power that would finally put us in our place. What she didn't know was who she was targeting. When the police arrived, the scene didn't unfold the way she imagined. There was no dramatic removal. No forced exit. No handcuffs or warnings. Instead, there was confusion. Then hesitation. Then something that looked a lot like discomfort. Because my wife wasn't just another resident. She wasn't someone who could be scared into leaving her own home. She wasn't someone who didn't understand the law. And she definitely wasn't someone without influence. The officers quickly realized that the call they responded to wasn't legitimate. That it was based on HOA claims, not legal orders. That there was no eviction notice issued by any court. No authority backing the demand. Just an HOA president trying to play judge, jury, and executioner. And as that realization spread, the power dynamic shifted. The HOA president went from confident to defensive. From commanding to agitated. Her authority only worked when people believed in it. The moment the police stopped playing along, her control began to crack. But this was only the beginning. What she didn't realize yet was that by calling 911, she hadn't just crossed a line. She had documented her abuse of power. She had involved an institution that took false reports seriously. And she had drawn attention from people who wouldn't be so easily intimidated. The neighborhood watched quietly as the officers left without taking any action against us. Whispers started almost immediately. Phones buzzed. Curtains shifted. Something had changed. The HOA president had made her boldest move yet, and it hadn't worked. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, unaware that her decision had set off a chain of events she could no longer control. Because now, the story wasn't about HOA rules anymore. It was about abuse of power. And it was about who really held authority. The neighborhood didn't return to normal after the police left. It couldn't. Something invisible but heavy had settled over the streets, like a truth everyone felt but no one had said out loud yet. The HOA president's authority, once unquestioned, now had a crack running straight through it. At first, she tried to act like nothing had happened. The same rigid posture. The same sharp looks. The same official-looking emails sent out to residents as if the incident had been a minor inconvenience rather than a public failure. But beneath the surface, panic was growing. Because she knew she had crossed a line. The police report existed now. A 911 call logged for an eviction that wasn't real. Officers who had personally witnessed the lack of legal authority. Names, badge numbers, timestamps. What she thought was a show of dominance had turned into a permanent record. My wife understood this immediately. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply observed. She knew systems. She knew how power actually worked, not how people pretended it worked. And she knew that people who abuse authority often collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. While the HOA president scrambled to regain control, my wife quietly started making calls. Not aggressive ones. Not threatening ones. Informational ones. Calm, precise, professional. The kind of conversations that didn't sound dramatic but carried serious consequences. The focus wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Word started spreading in ways the HOA president couldn't control. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years suddenly felt safe enough to talk. Stories surfaced about selective enforcement. About fines that never made sense. About threats that felt personal. About intimidation disguised as community standards. Emails circulated privately. Screenshots were shared. Old warning letters were pulled out of drawers. Patterns became impossible to ignore. And then came the shift. Residents who once avoided eye contact started stopping us to talk. Quietly at first. Then more openly. They didn't ask questions directly, but they hinted. They wanted to know if something was finally being done. If the HOA president's grip was loosening. If it was safe to speak up. The HOA board noticed too. Meetings became tense. Attendance increased. Questions were asked that had never been asked before. Financial records were requested. Enforcement policies were challenged. The HOA president, used to controlling the narrative, suddenly found herself on the defensive. She responded the only way she knew how. By escalating again. Another notice arrived, this one more aggressive than the last. It referenced legal action without actually citing any law. It demanded compliance without specifying violations. It carried the same empty threats, now sharpened with frustration. But this time, it didn't work. My wife documented everything. Every letter. Every email. Every date and time. She knew that power didn't come from loud reactions. It came from evidence. Behind the scenes, the situation was growing far beyond a neighborhood dispute. The misuse of emergency services had triggered internal reviews. Questions were being asked about how often HOA leaders attempted to involve law enforcement without cause. Training departments took notice. Supervisors reviewed reports. The system doesn't move fast, but it moves deliberately. The HOA president sensed it. Her behavior became erratic. She started showing up unannounced. She sent late-night emails. She pressured vendors and contractors, trying to assert control wherever she could still find it. But the more she pushed, the more resistance she met. Even the tone of the neighborhood changed. The fear that once kept people quiet was being replaced by something else. Confidence. Solidarity. A shared realization that the HOA president's authority had always been inflated by silence. And silence was ending. One afternoon, a notice went out announcing a special HOA meeting. The language was formal, but the urgency was obvious. This wasn't routine. This was damage control. Residents showed up in numbers no one expected. The HOA president stood at the front, attempting to project calm, but it was clear she was losing her grip. Questions came rapidly. About the 911 call. About selective enforcement. About whether HOA leadership even had the authority they claimed. For the first time, she didn't have clear answers. And for the first time, people saw it. My wife watched quietly, saying very little. She didn't need to. The truth was doing the work for her. The more the HOA president tried to justify herself, the worse it looked. Every explanation contradicted the last. Every excuse raised another question. By the end of the meeting, the outcome wasn't official yet, but it was inevitable. The HOA president was no longer untouchable. What she still didn't fully understand was that the consequences weren't limited to HOA politics. The misuse of 911 was now being evaluated at a level she couldn't influence. What she thought was a local power play had attracted attention from people who didn't care about neighborhood politics at all. They cared about abuse of authority and accountability. As the days passed, the HOA president grew quieter. Notices stopped coming. Emails slowed. Her presence around the neighborhood faded. It wasn't confidence anymore. It was retreat. But the real reckoning hadn't arrived yet. Because while she was trying to survive the fallout inside the neighborhood, something much bigger was approaching. Something she couldn't argue with. Something that didn't recognize her title or her clipboard. And when it arrived, it would end everything she thought she controlled. By the time the consequences arrived, the HOA president was already isolated. The neighborhood no longer treated her like a figure of authority. She wasn't avoided out of fear anymore. She was avoided out of discomfort. People who once nodded politely now looked past her. People who once complied without question now quietly refused. Power, once exposed as hollow, collapses fast. The review triggered by the 911 call had moved beyond the local level. What began as a single misuse of emergency services had revealed a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. Documentation from previous incidents surfaced. Calls made under the guise of community enforcement. Requests framed as emergencies when they clearly weren't. The system finally had a clear picture. And the system does not like being used. My wife was informed, not involved. That distinction mattered. She hadn't pushed. She hadn't threatened. She hadn't leveraged her position directly. She had simply allowed the process to unfold, confident that the truth carried enough weight on its own. When the findings came back, they were decisive. The HOA president was formally cited for misuse of emergency services. Training programs referenced her case as an example of what not to do. Her name, once associated with authority, was now tied to overreach and abuse. The very institutions she believed she controlled had turned away from her completely. Inside the neighborhood, the fallout was immediate. The HOA board called an emergency session without her. Legal counsel was brought in. Risk assessments were conducted. The board realized that her actions had exposed them to serious liability. Fines. Lawsuits. Public scrutiny. They moved quickly. Silence. Residents felt it instantly. The atmosphere changed. Notices stopped. Fines were re-evaluated. Policies were rewritten. The HOA, once feared, became what it was always supposed to be, a service, not a weapon. And then came the moment she never expected. Law enforcement representatives arrived, not for us, but for her. Not with aggression, but with formality. Not to intimidate, but to conclude. Statements were taken. Documentation was finalized. The process was methodical and irreversible. She tried to argue authority. Titles. Past influence. None of it mattered anymore. Because real power doesn't need to announce itself. It just acts. My wife never attended a single HOA meeting after that. She didn't need to. Her goal had never been to dominate. It had been to stop the abuse. And that goal had been achieved completely. Neighbors began reclaiming their sense of safety. Conversations returned to normal. Children played outside without tension. Lawns were still trimmed, houses still neat, but the fear was gone. The HOA president, now just another resident, kept to herself. The clipboard disappeared. The emails stopped. The presence that once felt overwhelming was reduced to nothing more than a cautionary memory. People talked about it quietly. Not with celebration, but with relief. Everyone understood the lesson. Authority without accountability is fragile. And those who mistake influence for control often forget that there is always someone above them. Someone who sees the whole system. Someone who steps in when lines are crossed. The HOA president thought calling 911 would end a problem. Instead, it ended her reign. Because she didn't know who my wife really was. And by the time she realized it, it was far too late.